When thinking of Cape Town, you might imagine white sand beaches, wine estates, and the imposing Table Mountain. But this beautiful city is one of the most dangerous in the world, and it has the highest murder rate in South Africa. Most murders and other types of violent crime are linked to gang activity in the Cape Flats. The flats, as they are called locally, are an area of densely packed townships on the outskirts of Cape Town.
Cape Town is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's also one of the most dangerous. Over the past decade, a lethal mix of gangs and guns has caused a surge in the murder rate. More than 3,000 people were murdered here. The number has doubled in a decade. In some areas,
You come on our turf and you will not belong to a gang of us, and we get you, we kill you. Because there's no mercy with them. Well, the same thing they do with us. My job, I'm a killer. I went to prison for shooting someone dead.
Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are actually going to talk about a subscriber suggested case, and just a massive thank you to everyone who writes to me and takes the time to write to me. It is really lovely to hear from actual people and I really appreciate all of your suggestions. It is very special, so thank you again. But for today's case we are going to talk about a gang related case and how 4 men terrorized the people of South Africa and also the government of South Africa, because these 4 men were attacking tourists as well. And once again, South Africa was in the news for not the greatest of subjects. And when we do get into this case, it is the first known case in South Africa to ever use cell phone technology as a means to solve a crime. But just a heads up, we have little to no photos of the victims or the perpetrators in this case, but it still does not take away from the absolutely horrific and terrifying case that we are going to get into. So buckle up, it is going to be an absolutely wild ride, and with that being said, let's get into today's case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
Today we are heading back to 1969 when a young girl named Marilese Holmes was born in a very small farming community within Bloemfontein, located in the Free State. When Marilese was growing up, she really wanted to be something different. She wanted to get out of the small town and she wanted to make a name for herself. She had big dreams, big ambitions, and she just wanted to grow out of this small cage that was holding her down. So once Marilese matriculated and she finished school, she then went to the University of the Free State and she went there with a lot of her friends. So this was very comfortable and homey for her as well. Also, Marilese also had a younger sister named Liesel. And when Marilese was around 28, 29 years old, she landed a massive contract within her job. And she had basically been given the contract to run all the guest houses, and she would basically run all the guest houses in Cape Town, where she would bring international tourists from America to come to these houses, and she would basically run the sales and bringing everybody in, and also maintaining this property in terms of hiring all the staff, making sure all the events run properly. So she had a massive contract on her table, and she was earning very well as well. Marilese would also travel to and from America for this job, so she was comfortable going between both countries. But even though she would travel to America and see all these different states, but there was just one place that was completely unmatched with its beauty, its people, its culture, and this was one place that she adored going to, and that was Cape Town, South Africa. Marilese would say that Cape Town, South Africa was one of her most favorite places in the entire world. So while Marilese was earning quite well and selling the absolute beauty of our African sunset and bringing tourists into our magnificent country to stay in the guest houses, and while her career was doing very well on the side, she was also doing very well romantically as well. Marilese was in a blooming relationship with a man named Keim III, and he was an American businessman who lived in Fort Lauderdale in America. Keim was 33, and both Marilese and Eddie met on a business trip that Marilese was on in the States, and they became fast friends and then fast lovers, and the rest was basically history. And Marilese and Eddie would travel between South Africa and Florida, and they would keep going back and forth with each other. But yes, of course, Eddie and Marilese were in a very long distance relationship, but they made it work and they would travel to each other as often as they could. And then on the 31st of December 1997, so New Year's Eve 1997, Eddie flew down to Cape Town in order to meet Marilese and to spend the new year with her. And Marilese and Eddie just really ended up enjoying each other's company. They went to see all that Cape Town offered. So they went to the beaches, they went to all the sightseeing spots, and they were just really lapping up each other's company. And by all accounts, Eddie and Marilese were very much in love with each other, and they really enjoyed everything Cape Town had to offer, from the sunny skies, the blue oceans, and the breeze that came off the mountains. But while Eddie Keim III was staying in South Africa, specifically Cape Town, he stayed in the very fancy waterfront apartments in the V&A waterfront. And then on Sunday, the 4th of January 1998, so remember, Eddie was now in South Africa from the 31st of December last year, so 1997, and now it's the 4th of January 1998. But on the 4th of January, Sunday, the couple first went to see the movie Titanic that had just aired in South Africa, and they really hadn't got a chance to see it, so they wanted to see it because everyone was ranting and raving about how good Titanic was back then. And the night was still young, the movie had just finished, and Eddie and Marilese weren't really ready to go back to bed. Cape Town is so beautiful and there's so much to do and see. You really have to spend a lot of days seeing everything. So once the movie was done, the two then headed from the V&A waterfront where they were watching the movie. The couple then went to the most arguably romantic spots in Cape Town, and that is at the top of Signal Hill. Marilese and Eddie drove all the way up to Signal Hill in order to view the city lights. And when Marilese and Eddie went, the movie had ended quite late. So when they were on top of Signal Hill, it was really early hours of Monday, the 5th of January 1998. And sadly, little beknownst to them, while they were busy driving up Signal Hill, looking at these incredibly beautiful scenes below them, they were being followed, and sadly, their bodies would be found 30 kilometers away in the next couple of days. And sadly, in the next couple of days, police did get a call about a white male that was found on a beach near the Khayelitsha area. And there is a beach quite near to Khayelitsha where this white male's body was found. So when police first got to their scene, they saw that the male was lying face down in the sand. He had a single gunshot wound to the back of his head, and police assumed that he had been shot execution style. Police also noticed that when they turned the white male's body over, his mouth was open. And he also had a lot of sand within his mouth, which indicated to police that he was screaming or struggling, and the perpetrators were then pushing his head down into the sand in order to muffle his screams. Near his body, they found empty alcohol bottles, one pipe, and they also noticed that one of his sandals were missing. Then, around 15 kilometers away, police got another call for a white female's body that was found in the area. Also, just a warning for this next part. But when they found the female's body, she was lying 5 meters away from quite a busy road. There was a single gunshot wound to her head, but it looked like it entered underneath the chin and came out the left eye socket. An autopsy was done on both the male and female body, and the female body indicated that she had twice that night. And in the area between the male body that was found and 15 kilometers away where the female body was found, right in the middle was a burnt out green metallic BMW. And luckily the registration on this car had not been burnt when the car was burnt. And also DNA was then taken from the male and female bodies, and the DNA came back to be Marilese and Eddie's body, and that was Marilese's car that had been burnt as well. And sadly, no one knew exactly what happened between Signal Hill and Khayelitsha, where the bodies were roughly found, but this case got an insane amount of media attention. Not only was a couple taken from atop of Signal Hill, but one of the people within this couple was an American tourist. So this was now international news and not something that South Africa could just sweep under the rug. And because this case was such a hot topic at the time, calls were absolutely streaming into the police station. And tips were coming from left, right, and center, and police were absolutely inundated with tips and who could have done it. But then someone had called the police station to say that they knew who done it, and also they knew that there were more bodies involved. So police are trying to follow up with as many tips and leads as they could, and they did follow up with this one lead where they said that there were more bodies involved, because the police tracked down this tip, and a couple of kilometers away from where Eddie was actually found, they discovered another 2 bodies, and these were the bodies of Maggie and Mike Knott. They were a couple who lived in Somerset West, which is an area just outside of Cape Town, And they had been driving home. They had just pulled into their driveway where they were then hijacked. And this all happened on the 2nd of January, 1998. And this murder was incredibly and insanely cruel and overkill. Maggie and Mike were first beaten to the inch of their lives. Then Mike was shot several times. And not only did they also shoot Maggie, but they also strangled her as well. So like I said, just a massive amount of overkill, hatred, and anger in these killings. And as a side note, they were first shot execution style, and then there was overkill in shooting them multiple times as well. And the cartridges that were found near Maggie and Mike Knotz's bodies would later link to Marilese and Eddie's bodies as well. But while police were busy collecting the evidence, they soon realized that they were handling a lot of gang activity. And on the exact same weekend that Mike and Maggie were murdered, as well as Eddie and Marilese, a pastor and his son in Stellenbosch, they were busy driving in their white bakkie when they were then approached by 4 men, who then hijacked the boy and the pastor. The pastor managed to talk his way out of this incident, and he said, quote, "Do you know that you are in the presence of a child of God?" End quote. And they actually managed to get out of this entire situation, but the hijacker still took them to an open field where they found a single tree, and they tied both the pastor and the 10-year-old boy to the tree. And just before the hijackers were about to leave, one of them turned around and said to the pastor, quote, "You can be lucky we never killed you because we usually do." End quote. And then the 4 of them then got into the white bakkie and drove off, leaving the pastor and the child tied to the tree. And while police were busy looking into the DNA and looking into all of the tips and also now these new cases, they kept getting calls about who could have done it, but from different people about the same people. And police started to get very interested in this tip because it was coming from so many different sources that were unrelated. And the 4 people being mentioned from all these different callers was Richard Peterson, who was 28 years old at the time, and Marshall Andrews, who was 24 years old at the time. The third man apparently in this tip to be involved, his name was Dawood Dustiger, and the 4th man was named Charles Marcus. Richard and Marshall were first both arrested and they were taken into police custody. However, when Charles and Dawood caught wind that they were going to be arrested by the police, a shootout then ensued on the outskirts of Paarl, and both Dawood and Charles were killed in action at the shootout. And DNA that was taken from Dawood and Charles would later match to of Marilese. Richard Peterson and Marshall Andrews were both charged in the High Court of Cape Town with 4 counts of murder, 6 counts of assault, and 3 counts of theft. However, the prosecution had a very difficult task on hand because they had no witnesses, they had no physical DNA, and there was actually nothing really linking Richard and Marshall to these crimes. The DNA that would match Marilese was linked to Dawood and Charles, who had already been killed in action, so they weren't on trial anymore. But both Richard and Marcel pleaded not guilty to any of these charges. And the prosecution was actually incredibly discouraged by this because there was no evidence and they really were very, very close to throwing this case out. The only piece of evidence that they actually had linking Marcel to anything so far was a single fingerprint on a CD that was found inside Marilese's car. But what these 4 killers actually didn't know was that while they were calling off of Marilese's phone, the phone that they had stolen out of her car when they hijacked her and Eddie, is that every time they used it, they were leaving a digital trace and a digital fingerprint of wherever they were going, the timestamps, who they were calling, and the location they were calling from. The 4 of them had taken Marilese's phone out of her car. It seems as though 2 of them were using Marilese's phone and they were then calling another phone. And when police looked further into the other phone that they were calling, it seemed to be linked to a brother-in-law of Dawood's. Remember, he was one of the 4 guys. And these 4 criminals were calling different people, but one of the ladies that they were calling, her name was Adula Davids, and there were a lot of calls going to her, and police then knocked on her door because they were like, listen, your name is involved in this case. Why are you involved in this case? And Adula absolutely spilled the beans about everything. She was not meant to be involved like that, and she wanted nothing to do with this case. And when Adula actually came forward and was talking to police about everything that she knew, she was an incredible witness and a very integral part of this case. But Abdullah said that in 1998, in December, she and her daughter were at home when her daughter's boyfriend came to the house, and her boyfriend's name was Charles Marcus. And remember, Charles was one of the 4 guys in this gang to be involved apparently in these murders. But basically, Charles came over to the house and he then came up in a gold Mercedes Benz. And at the time, Abdullah Davis lived in Mitchell's Plain, and so did her daughter with her in this house. So it is important for the color of this car because he first rocked up in a gold Mercedes, and then in January of 1999, he all of a sudden then rocked up in a cream Mercedes. Abdullah would also say that whenever Charles would come to the house to visit her daughter and be a boyfriend to her daughter, there would always be 3 other guys waiting outside, and the 3 other guys was Dawood, Rashad, and Marcel. But what was quite damning was Abdullah said that in the very first day of January, he came with a cream-colored car. Then around the 4th or 5th of January, he came then with a green metallic-colored BMW. And he rocked up in the early hours of the morning to Abdullah's house to show her this green metallic BMW. And the reason that Charles had rocked up to Abdullah's house early hours of the morning was that he wanted to ask Abdullah if she wanted to buy this car and the cell phone off of him. So the court then ordered for the phone companies to provide all the information they could about these 2 cell phone numbers. And one cell phone number, remember, being Dawood's brother-in-law's phone, which apparently the perpetrators had used that night, and Marilese's phone, which was still working after she apparently had been murdered. So the phone companies did hand over all of their phone records, and they handed it to one of the first specialists in the country, which was a GIS specialist or a geographical information specialist. And he said that he was quite confident that he could find and locate where the 4 of them had gone that night based on the phone records. So what this GIS specialist had ascertained from that night was that Marilese's phone had been taken on Signal Hill, but it was almost used immediately within the vicinity. So the GIS specialist assumes that the 4 of the men then split up into 2 cars, and they had then called each other from Marilese's phone to Dawood's brother-in-law's phone in order to communicate. So Marilese and Eddie were hijacked on Signal Hill. Her phone was then taken and the gang then split into 2 different cars. The 2 gang members then went with Marilese and Eddie in the same car, and then they drove down Signal Hill and they then went to different rendezvous points. At some point, when they got to one of the rendezvous points, they then dragged Eddie out of one of the cars and put them with the other 2 gang members, and Marilese was then taken to a different area. Marilese at the time had Vodacom as her cell phone provider, and Dawood's brother-in-law had MTN as his service provider. I will put some of the phone records presented in court on the screen so you can see the different areas that the 2 gang members went and where they were located in at the time. A total of 12 calls were made from Marilese's phone to the MTN number, and the records show that at 10 to 2 on Monday the 5th of December 1999, the area where Eddie's body was found was the area that the Vodacom cell phone number was pinging from the tower. And remember, Marilese had the Vodacom cell phone. So basically where Eddie was found murdered, there was a massive ping from the Vodacom cell phone tower to show that her phone was also in that area at the same time. And during the entire incident, 5 different calls were made from the area where Marilese was found murdered as well. Then it showed that 2 cars moved in the same direction after Marilese and Eddie had apparently been murdered, and they then moved towards the area of Mitchell's Plain, where they then tried to sell Abdullah the green BMW, which was actually Marilese's car. Abdullah said that Charles tried to sell her the car at around 3 a.m. Monday morning. But while this was all being said in court, Rashad and Marcel said that they had a defense, and their defense was that they actually had an alibi for that night, and none of this was them, and it was 2 different guys, and they weren't involved at all. They basically said that they had a joint family friend funeral that they went to, and it couldn't possibly have been them on Sunday when Marilese and Eddie were murdered. But the court was making their findings, and it was proving that they could track all 4 men's movements from Signal Hill all the way back down to Mitchell's Plain. And basically the court came to the conclusion that the hijackers must have traveled with Eddie and Marilese down Signal Hill. And like I said earlier, that the other vehicle had the other 2 gang members in it, with the MTN cell phone, which was Dawood's brother-in-law's cell phone. And even though Darwood and Charles were no longer alive, they found a pubic hair on Marilese's thigh as well as semen, and the pubic hair was linked to Darwood's DNA and the semen was linked to Charles's DNA. The court also found that Richard and Marcel's alibis did not check out, and the people who actually tried to defend the alibi, they ended up contradicting each other, which just made their alibi fall apart even more. In the end, the court found Richard and Marcel guilty on all charges. And then on the 23rd of September 1999, Richard and Marcel were sent to life in prison, and they were deemed an incredible danger to society. And they would be allowed to get their sentences reviewed in September of 2029. But that does not mean that they will get any appeal or any early release. It's just a review of their sentence. And this was the first case in South Africa where a case led to a conviction of anyone involved based on absolutely no physical or DNA type of evidence, only really relying on the cell phone records. And having such strong cell phone records to be able to link and follow people's movements at the time of their murders. But that is the case of Marilese Holmes and Eddie Keim III. Things can really change in an instant. And when talking about these cases, it really just makes you want to hug your loved one just a little bit tighter tonight. So make sure you give your loved ones that hug. Don't talk to strangers. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.